All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Kyle Lanslone Show. And I am very excited for my guest I have today. He is somebody who I've been reading a long time, and his analysis really gives a lot of great insight into the U.S. military and the multiple wars we're fighting. So, everybody, today I have joining me Michael Vlahos. He is a senior fellow with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, a military historian and strategist, and professor with the U.S. Naval War College. Michael, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, I have quite a bit I want to talk to you about today. You've written some really fascinating articles in the past few months, particularly two stories that I wanted to focus on
Mhm.
are articles that you wrote for the American Conservative and Responsible Statecraft. The first titled America's Military is in Big Trouble, and the second, the U.S. Navy Five Roads to Ruin. And in that second article, you write, yet today the Navy is in trouble. The Navy and its boosters in Congress want the U.S. to believe the problem is all about too few ships and too few facilities. And so, in both of these articles, you say that the U.S. military is in big trouble. And I think if I just went around to friends and family and said that, they would instinctively disbelieve me because they know that the US military budget is at least near $1 trillion. So, how could our military possibly be in trouble?
The worst thing that ever happened to the American military was the fall of the Soviet Union combined with this fantasy uh, victory, this ecstatic moment of transcendence over Saddam Hussein, as though the US could vanquish any military force on the planet, which even at that time wasn't true, but the optics, the grand theater, it was really like an opera in 1991. It created a kind of a celestial authority of American arms that convinced everyone that there had never been and will never be another military power as great as the United States. And combined with that, with our absolute fetishistic obsession with technology as the key to victory and the key to all success in warfare. And then the third, the idea that the more money we spent, the greater our military, as though dollars in equal greatness in military terms coming out, are three illusions that we not only accepted and embraced, but enshrined. So that since 1991, now that's a good period of time, we have come to the point where we live within the mythology of our greatness that we created. And it's a false mythology. And it's a false mythology that has not been properly corrected. That mythology was corrected for the truly great U.S. military that won World War II because the U.S. stumbled into the Korean War, where it was almost immediately soundly defeated by a ragtag army of sneaker clad communist Chinese and suffered one of the great campaign defeats of U.S. arms, the greatest since the Battle of Fredericksburg and the campaign of 1862. And so the U.S. had to take stock of what it was doing in the 1950s and 60s. And yet, even then, we were so full of hubris that we marched into Vietnam thinking, oh, well, we have a new technology now, air mobile warfare with helicopters. We can do anything we want. And well, we know how that turned out in Vietnam. But the fact is, the U.S. at least had to deal with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And the Soviet Union had a gigantic military. And we were very careful and we had to be circumspect about how we used our military. And all the gloves came off with the fall of the Soviet Union. And then you had that capstone ecstatic experience of Desert Storm, where it looked like we were the gods of war. We were Olympians. We could cast down our bolts of lightning, and everyone would quake and quiver at the thought that the US would send in its military. And it is remarkable to me that given the forever wars that we've fought since 2001, where we have achieved nothing, killed millions of people, and not achieved anything like a victory in any of these contexts, and yet we still believe that we are the greatest. And you could see the doddering, senescent Joseph Robinette Biden talking how, oh, the US is the greatest military that's ever been. We can do anything we want. And the fact is, we can't. We failed in our proxy war against Russia to bring Russia down. And our military today is a hollowed out shadow of what it once was. And all of that money goes into the coffers of the military industrial complex. And it is a profit driven, lifestyle oriented military. It exists to live off the fat of the land, which is, of course, the gigantic defense budget, and then to produce immaculate weapons that, of course, cannot sustain the intensity of actual combat. And we know that's true because in the intensity of actual combat in Ukraine, those weapons have all been used up, and our immaculate weapons, the M1 Abrams tanks, the HIMARS, the Patriot missiles, they've all failed. They haven't failed necessarily in terms of their performance as weapon systems, but they failed in terms of fulfilling the godlike authority that we invested in them. And so America's taken a big hit. But I have to say, although it's taken a big hit in the eyes of the rest of the world, in the eyes of Americans, we're still the greatest. And that
Yeah.
that is a terrible conceit.
So I just want to ask you about the money again, because this is where I think a lot of people get caught up. They know the figure that the U.S. spends as much as the next 10 countries combined on their military. Our military budget is 10 times the size of the Russians, 5 times the size of the Chinese. And
Mm,
so I think a part of it is this idea of American greatness, right? Even if there is a significant amount of theft going on, even if a lot of these funds are being siphoned off, I think we still imagine that with the amount of money that we're spending, we can wage this proxy war against Russia, prepare for a massive military buildup against China for a war over Taiwan in the Pacific, and defend Israel in the Middle East. Are you saying that's not possible even with $1 trillion a year?
no. And the truth is, and I hope this is the truth is that the people at the top, the so called leadership, understand that we're not in a position in any way to fight a real war. We could fight a war for a week, maybe 10 days, and then we'd have to stop because we'd have run out of everything. In the 12 days that we defended Israel, we used up all of our weapons. We shot them all. And we've been drawing down our weapons to support Ukraine, and we cannot produce enough weapons, meaning missiles and ordnance and the like, to sustain any kind of high intensity combat. So I'm going to say, and this is important, and it's actually a very positive message, and that is that if our leaders understand this, and they must, then it's a piece of good news because it means we can bluster, but we can't actually escalate to fight a war. We can't risk it. So in a way, that's not terrible. It's a terrible place to be in if you're thinking of American national security in real terms. But in terms of restraining the unbridled exercise of American power, it is good news. And nothing's going to turn that around. There's no way that we can produce enough artillery shells or enough Patriot missiles or AMRAAMs or Standard 2 missiles. It's just not going to happen. We brought in we were in such bad shape, we brought in a Turkish company to produce 155 millimeter artillery shells. And we boasted that we'd boost our monthly production from in the 17, 18,000 a month range to 40,000. And it didn't happen. There are too many supply chain issues, too many problems with getting qualified labor. It's not happening. So the only way the U.S. could become a great military power capable of fighting a big war would be a national mobilization. And that is absolutely out of the question. So, what we are is what the communist Chinese in the 50s used to call a paper tiger.
Well, so you mentioned there that this is good news, I guess, so long as the leadership recognizes that we're a paper tiger. Now, I guess one indication to me that the White House recognized this would have been wrapping up the proxy war in Ukraine. And so how confident are you that they do recognize this in the Trump administration? I really thought the early Trump administration would be dominated by headlines from officials in the DOD running around with red flags saying the Biden administration completely depleted our arms stockpiles. Our depots are empty. We are in trouble. It
Right.
is going to take us years to refill our stockpiles, much less send all the arms to Taiwan that we want to send and refill all the stockpiles around the world we depleted. And so, do you think that this is a message that and a situation that's understood in the White House in particular? I guess most importantly.
Yes. It's understood in the White House, I believe.
Okay,
Also
great.
understood in the Kremlin. It's understood in Beijing, and it because it's so clear. And I think this helps to explain why Mr. Trump, when he decided to bomb Iran, did that to end the war that Israel had started through what's it, an immaculate act that would have the residual authority of American technology supremacy behind it, and that everyone would then say, "Oh, hold up our hands and go, that's it, we're done." And we coordinated that with Iran, and the whole point of that attack was to stop the reckless, aggressive, escalatory behavior of Israel, and yet that attack highlights what America is today as a military power. It's very much like the late Roman Empire in the sense that it has a lot of residual authority because people still have in their heads the idea that America is the greatest military on earth. And therefore, if you conduct a very carefully shaped, nicely presented, and deployed ceremonial act like that bombing at Fort then you can still have impact. But I think the fact that Mr. Trump did it that way is an indication that he understands that there's not much more we can do. And when it comes to Ukraine, it's the same thing. However, there are other issues there, and we should perhaps discuss those.
Well, when it comes to Ukraine, uh, Trump has said that he wants to have this program where he's going to send $10 billion in weapons to Ukraine paid for by the Europeans. And so, that doesn't seem to me like the policy of a man that understands that the arms depots are actually the bigger problem, not the treasury. Trump really seems hung up on, at least to me, on this idea that Biden was getting ripped off, that he was just sending the arms over there for free. And that was the key mistake that Biden made, not necessarily that he sent so many arms and depleted the American stockpiles.
Well, when when Mr. Trump came into office, he wanted to end the war on his terms. And you have to ask yourself, why did he want to end it on his terms? Why couldn't he just end it in ways that would promote a general settlement that would be stable in the future? And the answer is that the Ukraine war was predicated by Mr. Biden on the destruction of Russia, on bringing Russia to its knees, and that Europe was hard over on this enterprise. And therefore, he found himself in a situation where it was not possible to end the war on mutual terms that would lead to a larger lasting settlement, because that would look like a defeat for NATO, because NATO and the previous administration and their imperial court was so hard over on defeating Russia. And to accede to Russia, even if it meant a general settlement, and the settlement that's probably going to eventuate anyway, that would entail an admission, a confession that the US and Europe had engaged in a feckless war and had been defeated. And so Mr. Trump was faced with a situation where, unless he could bring the war to a conclusion on his terms, it would ipso facto, no one could ignore it, be an admission of defeat. And one thing that he can't do, that no American president can do, is accept defeat at the hands of the Russians. And yet, there is no way in which we can, quote unquote, prevail. Therefore, what is happening now, I believe, is a very long recession. It is an attempt to orchestrate a slowing down to the point where we just are able to then wrap it up and leave. And part of this is going to be the Russian victory that is impending. And it is, believe me, impending. And so the thing that Mr. Trump can't do right now is settle the war. So what does he hit upon? As you mentioned, oh, the Europeans will buy $10 billion of American weapons. But the Europeans don't have that money, and we don't have the weapons. And Ukraine is unraveling as we speak. So I think what he's doing is playing a waiting game so that there will, over the course of the next several months, emerge a fait accompli, meaning that there just won't be anything to do because Ukraine will be coming apart. And at that point, some agreements can be made and then we can get out. But it's not possible to come to an agreement in which the U.S. is titularly defeated.
Okay.
You remember that Nixon did this. I mean, Nixon sacrificed his presidency so as to attain the Holy Grail, which he never did, which was called peace with honor. A stupid idea. I mean, I understand where he's coming from, but it's always better to get out when you're in a losing situation. Because no matter how bad that situation is, the moment you leave, things begin to get better. And most nations in a situation where they're losing keep saying, well, we have to double down. We can still pull it out. We've got to keep going. The more you keep going, the worse it gets. The sooner you leave, no matter how hard and awful it looks when you make that decision and you know you actually cut the
Hmm.
cables. As soon as you do that, as soon as you leave the dock, it gets better.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the war in Ukraine. I've long felt that this is a war of attrition waged on the Russian side. And if that's the case, there could be a few breaking points, whether that's financially, that the West runs out of money to send weapons to Ukraine, or weapons, they simply run out of arms to send to Ukraine. But the one I've had the least insight in, and of course get the most questions about, is Ukrainian manpower. And
Right.
of all the estimates and kind of analysis I've seen of this, I think your article from Landmarks Magazine earlier this year, accepting the truth about Ukrainian casualties is the only real path to peace, where you kind of explain, break down for Ukraine, arithmetic says the number of soldiers who are either so injured they can't fight again or have lost their lives is not less than 920,000 men. And of course, that was earlier this year. So I'm sure, as the war is going on, that has ticked up a little bit more. So, how did you come to this conclusion?
I had many intersecting vectors of information,
Hmm.
and I had to put together a mosaic of losses. I had many people who had information, but there's lots of information out there, including not bad information from Ukrainian leaders themselves occasionally when they let things slip. But the truth is that in a war of attrition, and Mr. Putin waged a very careful war of attrition. And when I say careful, he has waged a war of attrition in which Ukraine will fall and Russia will be spared the huge number of casualties that otherwise would be required in a kind of force majeure, where you go big on, big arrow, big attack. You lose a lot of people in those attacks. Mr. Putin cannot afford to lose people. So he's waged a war in which he's carefully shepherded and protected his troops in order to minimize casualties. And the flip side is everything that has been done in the war has focused on maximizing Ukrainian casualties. The result is a terrible bloodletting. And the most carefully guarded secret throughout this entire war has been Ukrainian casualties. And the reason is that if the West understood that Ukraine was bleeding out over the course of historical time, very short historical time, that this war would look as a terrible stain on America. In other words, we're happy to sacrifice this nation for our vanity, for our narcissism. The truth is that the Ukrainian nation was deeply in decline when the war started. It was something like 37 or less million people, and everyone said 45, but it was really much lower. And then when the war broke out, millions of Ukrainians fled to either Russia or Western Europe, and then the Russians took about 20% of Ukraine. So Ukraine withered in the first several years of the war to about half the population that it was. Ukraine today, it looks big on the map, but it's about the size of the Netherlands. And it's suffered as a percentage of its population losses that are higher than France suffered in World War One. And believe me, France was a broken nation in 1918. It had lost so many men, it had so many amputees, the mutilés, that it was in no position to fight a war again. And we saw that in 1940. France was broken. Well, this is what's happening to Ukraine. But the difference is Ukrainians, unlike Frenchmen, French are pretty damn stoic, as we saw in Verdun. But the fact is that Ukrainians have some amazing stoicism and they just keep dying. And here's the deal, they've been losing at least 20,000 men a month, every month since the war began. And today, and this is from Ukrainian cabinet minister, they're losing 26,500 people a month. And so 350 dead every day, 750 badly wounded, and AWOL 500. Now you add all that up, they're losing 328,000 people a year. And they're making that up by kidnapping at gunpoint and through the most ruthless physical abuse, men who often they're inducting men who are disabled, who are, they're even taking what we call handicapped people, and they're throwing them in the front lines where they all die. And so the net loss for Ukraine's army is 120,000 a year. Meanwhile, Russia, which is full of volunteers, amazingly, they're gaining 120,000 every year. So the preponderance is so great vis-a-vis the numbers in both armies that Ukraine is not in a position to truly hold on much longer. And you can see this in the latest offensive actions in Pokrovsk, in Konstantinovka and Liman, that they don't have enough men to actually cover things. And those guys are all dying. And they, when they kidnap somebody in his 60s and thrust him into the front line with a helmet and a flak jacket and an AK-47, he lasts a day, maybe less than a day. They all die, and there are not enough of them to actually physically cover the line. So what we're seeing is a real unraveling, and it's taken a long time. And it's taken a long time because this is a deliberate strategy pursued by Russia, not out of cruelty, but to preserve Russian lives, and it's been very successful. And if you look at losses among the Russian Federation forces, they keep going down and down and down. And when this war is over, we're going to see an astonishing casualty ratio between Ukrainian dead and Russian dead. It's going to shock everybody. And the problem is, if you keep this war going much longer, there won't be a Ukraine. The, the fertility rate in Ukraine is 0.7, and nobody is having children. And Ukraine is holding on to its young people, 18 to 25 years old, because if those young men are thrust into the battlefield, which is what all the fire-breathing NATO honchos want, there won't be a Ukraine. All their men will be dead. So we're looking potentially at a Ukraine post-war that has shrunk from 52 million in 1990 down to the size of Belarus, 10 million. It's a tragedy, and it's a crime, and it's all on us.
So my last question here as we wrap up, and this is my real concern about the war going in this direction, is that we're going to see a collapse of the Ukrainian military. Essentially, Kiev, whether that's Zelensky or somebody else, is going to be forced to pretty much, you know, agree to whatever Russia wants at the barrel of a gun. I think this will mean Russia taking Ukraine's Black Sea coast, extending their territory all the way to Transnistria. But what remains in Ukraine will be a rump state. And I would imagine that the people that are left there are going to really hate the Russians. And there's already a large and I think in some respects ascendant group of neo-Nazis like Andres Belitsky who now have a lot of power in Kiev. And my concern is that there are going to be people in the US establishment like Hillary Clinton, who I remember on the night of the Russian invasion, she was cackling with Rachel Maddow, tapping her fingers together like Mr. Burns, and explaining how this is going to be a CIA operation like Afghanistan. And so my concern is essentially this, that Russia is going to bite off a large chunk of Ukraine, and then the CIA is just going to make it bloody and continue to inflict losses on Russia from people, insurgents within former Ukrainian territory. And even if the land war stops, even if Russia stops trying to take territory, it doesn't mean that the killing is anywhere near over.
Well, Mr. Putin is well aware of these undercurrents in Ukraine. And the biggest, we can always blame Uncle Joe Stalin for this, because Stalin insisted on grabbing Western Ukraine, which had never been part of the Russian, paterfamilias. He took places that had been Polish, like Galicia, or Austrian for centuries. And there's a whole hardcore element in Ukraine that hates Russia and that is, in fact, neo-Nazi. And the legacies there are deep and embedded. And yes, they have been stoked and amplified by the CIA. The CIA was running a guerrilla war in Ukraine after 1945 for 5 years, for God's sake. So yes, we'll try to do everything. But I think what Mr. Putin will try and do is get a Ukraine that can be demilitarized and have enough of a buffer that the rest of Ukraine, which is Russian speaking and often pro-Russian, will be a kind of separation. If this turns out to be a defeat, and it looks like that's the only outcome available at this point, then that might be salutary in the sense that the U.S. might back off. Continuing to make this um, a war against Russia is a recipe for absolute disaster. The best option is for Ukraine to become a neutral country like Austria, and to be a kind of buffer place. And I simply, I've been in Washington a while. I simply cannot understand the the rabid intensity, the lust in Washington to bring down Russia. It risks so much. It leads the U.S. and Europe into a conflict that could be cataclysmic, and yet we persist in it. The embedded hatred is something like I've never seen. It outdoes the hatred that, say, uh, Britain had for Germany or France had for Germany in the older days. It's a neuralgia. It's creepy.
Well, it certainly is, and very destructive, not only to Ukraine, but also to the United States. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I really appreciate your time. I hope to have you back on the show again in the future. And I recommend everybody follow you on Twitter. I believe it's just Michael_Vlahos, right?
It's something like that. Michael Vlahos. Yeah, I'm
All
there.
right.
You'll find me. My last name is the same. So thanks,
All
Kyle.
right.
Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
having me on. Take care now.
You too.